Tonight, we mark one of the darkest yet most defining nights in Turkey's modern history, July 15, 2016. A night when rogue jets bombed the Turkish Parliament. F-16s targeted the presidential complex. Tanks rolled over civilians and citizens were shot on the streets. All orchestrated by the FETO terrorist organization in a plot to overthrow a democratically elected government. More than 250 people were killed, over 2,200 injured. It was a steep price, but within hours, the nation had crushed the coup. It was also a night of extraordinary defiance. Turkish people stood united. Security forces refused unlawful orders, and under the leadership of Turkey's president Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey had reclaimed its democracy. Welcome to your special coverage. I'm Jafar Hasnan.
And I'm Isabel Ewing. For decades, the FETO terror organisation had secretly infiltrated state institutions, including the army. It sought to overthrow the government and conspire against top officials. Now the country still carries the scars from that night, yet Turkey's democracy lives on.
Düştüğümde bu bacağım, sol bacağım böyle şuramda duruyordu. Bu diz kapağının üstünden 22 santim kemiği eritmiş kurşunlar. Eriyince buradaki bacak dönmüş kaslarla beraber. Şuramda şöyle duruyordu. Ayağımın topu, yani alt tarafı. Selah verildi.
Once I heard the mosques began to recite the selah, I just couldn't stay home any longer. I turned to my wife and said, "The kids are in your care now. I'm going." As we moved, crowds kept joining us, including young, old, men and women. That group of 50 turned into 1,000 along the way. About 50 meters before the Harbiye Officers Club, a police truck was blocking the road. I walked up and asked, "What's going on?" The police said, "It might be dangerous beyond this point." And I said, "What danger? What could possibly happen? Are the soldiers really going to open fire on their own people? That's just too much." We kept marching, chanting tekbir. Right in front of the military officers' club, a soldier was standing guard. I greeted him and kept walking for about 20 meters. Then 2 bullets came from the front. They hit my right leg, right on the kneecap. Then 3 more bullets came from my left side, from the direction of the officers' club. 2 hit my left kneecap and 1 hit my calf. Remember that police officer who hadn't let us go? He crawled his way over and started pulling out the veterans, the wounded, one by one. He got to me last. They dragged me into a side street. A car stopped. The car was already packed with wounded. The seats, the floor, everywhere was full. And from that moment on, a journey began. One that's lasted about 9 years now. I have undergone 24 surgeries, but believe me, none of that matters. I'm not the kind of person who dwells on these things. I live for the flag. I would die for the flag. The rest is meaningless. As long as the Republic of Turkey stands, people like me will always rise up. Look over there. You see the flags waving in front of the officers' club. They're flying high. That's enough for us. That's all that matters. I live for the flag. That night, I had my flag in my hand. So what if it got shot? Yaşar Parlak got shot. Yaşar Parlak got injured. Now I have to live the rest of my life with 2 canes. None of that is a problem. I swear, not at all. I don't care. In fact, forget that night. Even now, even at this very moment, I swear, if I heard there was another such attempt, I would walk all the way to Ankara with these 2 canes. You can do whatever you want to Yaşar Parlak. I'll forgive it. It doesn't matter to me. But I will never forgive what's done to my homeland, my flag, and my nation.
mücadelemiz
Our fight against FETO continues at the same speed. The heroes that fell to the ground here, we will avenge their blood. Those who attack their own state and country, those who sell their souls for $1 will have to pay the price for it. Without giving up, without making mistakes, and by making the distinction between victims and the perpetrators, we are going to hopefully stop this threat element. And for this, we are always going to be careful and meticulous. I underline this once again, and I pray that God will help us all.
Welcome to our vantage point here at the Bosphorus, where we're going to be talking about July 15th, commemorating one of the most important nights that have had a tremendous impact on the near history, the modern history of the Republic of Turkey. Joining me, I have Matthew Bryza, former U.S. ambassador. Matthew, thanks for joining me now. A lot's been said about July 15th, and I'd like to call it a very unprecedented night, one that started in darkness and ended in light, not only with the sunrise, but also with the way events unfolded. You were here that night. Let's start a little talking about your personal experience here that night.
Sure, Yusuf, thank you. That's a beautiful way to put it, by the way, and I'm so honored to be here partaking in this commemoration of how strong Turkish democracy is. So, I mean, the first feeling I had was of utter disbelief. I was with my daughter watching some cartoons. She's 5 years old, and my wife said, you ought to come put on the news, and I was utterly shocked, like everybody in Turkey. And I was suddenly I felt like my stomach drop, because it made me think, like, what really does it mean if there was a successful coup? I started running through my mind all the changes that would come. For me, I'm now in business, former government official, as you said, and my family, and would I be safe to stay with my family in Turkey? What would it all mean? And I was really frightened by the prospect that it could succeed. And of course, I mean, as somebody who's worked on U.S.-Turkish relations forever and embraces Turkey for having a strong democracy, that was terrifying as well. But then when I learned from the TV broadcast that the tanks had stopped, the people had come out after President Erdogan appealed on FaceTime, I knew already that the coup was not going to succeed, and I started to feel strength and even pride in the Turkish people for having weathered the storm.
I think that's a really good question, though. What would it have meant? I mean, if there was an alternative reality, let's say the coup's successful, many people jailed, democracy in shatters in this country, how is that going to impact Turkey's relationship with the Western world? I mean, when we look at Western values, the will of the people, that's been utterly disregarded. You have a complete usurpation of democracy and the people's will. In that alternative reality, where would Turkey have gone right now? I mean, probably wouldn't be speaking here with each other.
Yeah, we certainly wouldn't see all the construction cranes on the horizon as investment continued to flow in here. First thing I thought was the economy is dead. Nobody's going to invest in Turkey. Nobody will come here. And then, of course, I was thinking about, well, what you just said. Politically, well, at the time, I thought the U.S. official response was lackluster, to be polite. I thought it was actually totally inappropriate in the beginning. But I knew, as you were just saying, Yusuf, that would turn around when U.S. officials realized there had been a usurpation of power by a cult that had infiltrated the military, the police, the courts, that was going to be a disaster for the relations of Turkey with the United States, with Europe, with the entire democratic world. And so it felt like there was just a collapse of possibility, of an optimistic future that is why I moved to this country. I mean, I resigned as a diplomat, or retired, I guess you could say, in 2012. I could have lived anywhere, could have gone back to my country, but I knew this was a place that, at least for me, held real promise for my family, for me, for my future in the business world, and just suddenly that all felt like it was potentially snuffed out.
But why didn't former U.S. President Barack Obama come out much stronger, or Kerry come out much stronger than Secretary of State, with a much more clear, transparent message to Turkey where they weren't stressing continuity, but you heard the word democracy more.
Yeah, I thought that Secretary Kerry's initial remarks were just inappropriate and destabilizing. What he should have said is what President Obama said a few days later. To paraphrase that, it would be a tragedy for us if the democratically elected government of a NATO member state was overthrown militarily. That has never happened in the history of NATO. That calls into question the entire structure of NATO as the world's most successful political military alliance in history. But Secretary Kerry, he made, you may remember, a strange remark where he was basically warning President Erdogan not to react, not to overreact in going after the coup plotters, because that, he implied that could lead to, well, calling into question Turkey's membership in NATO. Totally inappropriate response at that point. It should have been, we stand with the democratically elected government, whether we agree with everything or not, of our NATO ally.
But definitely, I mean, there should have only been one response.
Yeah.
We're talking about NATO, shared values, obviously democracy, the bedrock of NATO, of every NATO
Yep.
member. And it was a very, very bizarre night. Let's fast forward a little to the post-coup years, how that relationship between Turkey and the United States was impacted. You had that key issue. You had Obama partnering up with the YPG in Syria. Two major issues that whenever U.S. and Turkish officials came, that kind of turned into a bottleneck because the Turks were like, you're my ally. How are you working with these guys who are my mortal enemies? So that period, what stood out the most for you?
Sure. What stood out, okay, was we have to back up just a little bit, back to the immediate reaction to the coup attempt. In Washington, there were a lot of officials who were openly wondering whether or not this whole coup was staged as an excuse to crack down on the opposition. I mean, they sincerely thought that, some of them. And then here in this country, what really struck me was there was an understandable belief that the U.S. maybe was behind the coup attempt because Fethullah Gulen obviously lived in the United States, had permanent residency status. He has or had all of his charter schools in the United States, made a lot of money there. So what really struck me was how the U.S. and Turkey were completely on different tracks in terms of understanding each other, assuming the other one had plotted the coup. And so it took a while for the U.S. elite political system to understand what actually happened and to understand that it was a cult that it had infiltrated the military, that had it succeeded, it would have been a disaster, and that, thank God, the democratically elected government stood. But still, the United States, there was such distrust in the relationship, and some of it predates. This goes back to March 1st, 2003, and the U.S. invasion of Iraq. But at that point, the distrust was so high, and the United States didn't feel, I think, it had a common strategic language with Turkey. And so took that bizarre step under the Obama administration, and President Obama appointed me as ambassador. He nominated me, so no hard feelings. But he decided to partner with a terrorist group against another terrorist group, which has always been contrary to U.S. policy, forever in my lifetime. And I can understand why here in this country that was incomprehensible.
Now the relationship with Trump back in power, it looks like it's about to see better days. I mean, it's better than it has been probably over the past decade, in my view. Do you think the Turks have finally put the whole FETO ordeal behind them with the U.S., have opened up a new page with Trump, especially with his demise and his death, the so-called leader, Fethullah Gulen? Do you think that was very important? And are we on the road, at least, back to the golden age? I would say maybe the 80s and 90s. Are we back to that golden age, or at least on a journey to that path again?
Yes, certainly on a journey. I mean, as you and I have discussed many times, my introduction to this country, this whole part of the world, was our deep collaboration to realize oil and gas pipelines from Azerbaijan, Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan, South Caucasus gas pipeline, when we really acted as one team, the U.S. officials and Turkish officials, together with our friends and partners in the private sector, public sector in Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. And you may also recall that in that time there was a strategic partnership between Israel and Turkey. That doesn't seem to be coming back on track. But the U.S. relationship with Turkey does seem to be moving back toward a strategic partnership. You've got a president in the United States that really genuinely respects and likes the Turkish president. number one. Number two, you've got a U.S. ambassador here who is very close to President Trump, who is so respected by President Trump that he, Ambassador Barrack, is now the envoy for Syria, and now is beginning to take a role in the South Caucasus, where just yesterday he was talking about the Zangezur corridor connecting Azerbaijan to its exclave of Nakhchivan through Armenia and onward to Turkey. So his role is expanding. That's because I think President Trump really trusts him. That's the man he put as ambassador in Turkey, and that's a sign that President Trump wants to rebuild a sense of strategic partnership with Turkey.
Matthew, great commentary. We're going to come back and discuss this more later on in the hour. You know, it's about almost 8:30 local time, and just around this time, about 9 years ago, when we started beginning to see the first actions that would turn into the failed coup attempt of July 15th. I mean, behind me is Kuleli Military Academy, the Bosphorus Bridge, very close, very important areas. But that night I was in Ankara and I heard the F-16s flying by very low. There was gunfire out in the streets, and the Turkish Parliament was bombed. Probably the most memorable part, or actually the unmemorable part, something I wouldn't want to remember. That was bombed, and I remember driving by, seeing that damage the next day. To take a closer look at the events in Ankara, especially the bombing of the parliament, we go to Asla Akbaş, who has this special report.
This is more than a hole in a parliament building. This is where democracy was directly attacked and defended. This is the spot the fighter jets bombed on the night of July 15, 2016, as part of a coup attempt by the FETO terror group. It's the Turkish Grand National Assembly. Now, I remember being here the day after and being shocked by the wreckage that was left behind. At the time, Parliament was in session. MPs from all parties had gathered, not knowing if they would make it out alive, but determined to defend democracy side by side. One deputy said, "I remember thinking, if I'll die here, standing for this country." The explosions shook these walls. You can still see traces of it here. But that night also marked something powerful: unity. Politicians who usually argue across the aisle stood together. And outside these walls, millions of civilians flooded the streets. Some faced tanks with nothing but flags in their hands. Over 250 people lost their lives. Thousands were wounded. These scars were left as they are, on purpose. They are reminders, not just of what happened, but of what was saved. Democracy here wasn't given, it was chosen, and it was protected right here in this very hall.
The FETO terrorist organization has been running a decades-long campaign to seize control of the Turkish state. Followers were pushed to infiltrate key positions in Turkey and across the world. Let's have a look at some of the areas infiltrated. Charter schools served as primary recruitment hubs for the FETO terrorist group to indoctrinate the next generation. Around 1,000 educational institutions across the world were owned and overseen by the FETO terrorist organization. Students influenced in these schools were then unfairly admitted to prestigious universities through manipulation of entrance exams and tests for military academies. Initially, the FETO terrorist group infiltrated the military through individual efforts, but covert members began stealing the exams for candidates in the late 1980s. Now, this enabled widespread infiltration into military academies, including key positions of command, chain, and authority. Notably, doctors affiliated with the FETO terrorist organization in military hospitals discharged about 500 military pilots to make way for the group's members. The FETO terrorist group utilized the financial resources of charitable foundations, various businesses, and media to fund their activities and exert political influence. Charitable foundations were used to expand operations globally under the guise of humanitarian efforts.
Funds raised through charity were invested in enterprises, including numerous newspapers. The media controlled by the FETO terrorist group played a pivotal role in shaping public perception, decimating misinformation that distorted even basic facts. All right, now let's head over to my colleague Isabel Ewing.
Mehmet Celik is the editorial coordinator at Daily Sabah, and he joins us live now in studio. Mehmet, thank you so much for being with us. So we've just been hearing from Jaffa the extent to which the FETO terror organisation was able to infiltrate all layers of the Turkish state. How did this happen?
Well, first of all, we need to understand that this took time. And this is why when we look at FETO and what it did on July 15, 2016, we should, if we want to really understand the group and how it was able to carry out this attack, we should go back to its roots and understand what kind of methods it used to establish itself as a huge intercontinental structure. First of all, if we look at Türkiye, for example, we see that FETO exploited several areas to actually create this image about themselves. One of them was that they tried to recruit very talented top students to their educational institutions. They exploited the educational area. Second, they exploited public's religious sentiments. I think this was one of the biggest areas, as the ringleader of the group was a cleric himself. And the other one was that they wanted to make sure they are able to have a good relationship and eventually establish themselves as a very strong financial structure. In addition to that, in bureaucracy and politics, they wanted to make sure that they establish that link between the structure and these other power centers, that, from regardless of which ideology was in the government, regardless of which party was in power in Turkey, they had that relationship with them, and they were able to have this influence over the power centers. Eventually, when all these actually combined with media, education, financial sector, NGOs was a big part. And I think throughout where they exploited the sentiment, public's religious sentiments, or at least sentiments when it comes to charity, they were able to create this perception about themselves, this image that they were a philanthropy, for example, institution. But after all, when we see that how they infiltrated, they took their time. They waited for the right moment. Over 4 decades, they were able to establish themselves, and eventually, when the state was able to notice them, when the state was able to put a set in front of them, they started taking counter actions. This is why when we look at July 15, 2016, we see that there were events that led to this actually coup attempt, beginning with 2012, when now Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan was the intelligence chief. There was an attempt to arrest him. There was this judicial coup attempt in 2013. Many actually even linked the 2013 Gezi riots to as part of this grand scheme to overtake the state. And through these infiltrations in the police, in the judiciary, in the security apparatus, or different institutions at the government, they were able to complete this picture complete this mechanism that was trying to invade the country. This is why many times when we use the concept of parallel state, it is because they established a structure that was not in the state or in the state, but they tried to manage the state. And I'm not talking just government, the state and different private sector institutions or NGOs from an outside shadow network. So you would look at an institution and you would say that now there is someone in charge, but really in parallel they would have a figure within that comes from the network that had influence over the institution itself. It was in a way managed from outside. Now that when the state was able to recognize this, acknowledge this, they put a set in front of it, and I think the public began to realize what this group was like as they were trying to portray themselves as something else. This is something that for our international viewers, I think it's important to highlight that FETO didn't begin on July 15. There's a 40 years of history behind that, as well as an international aspect of the FETO organization, because many believe that FETO was not necessarily an organic establishment within Turkey, but it had outside interference into the group and outside management of the group, and particularly several international intelligence agencies that actually were linked to this FETO group. That's why they were able to use the states or this country's aircrafts against its own citizens.
And what is FETO now? I mean, last year, of course, its ringleader died. Did that weaken the organization? What sort of state is it in now?
Within Turkey, of course, that struggle to clean the FETO members from different institutions, from different realms, and different levels of the country, that has been very successfully ongoing. It is not complete. As of today, there was operations towards some private sector that were in link with the FETO terror group. So that effort is still going on. Although FETO activities, although FETO threat is minimized within Turkey, there is still, because this is a very secretive group, we're a very shadowy group, that there are still those figures that they have been successful in concealing themselves as otherwise. But I think in addition to within Turkey, we should look at whether the group is still active in North America, in Europe, in some part of Asia or Africa. When we look at the group from a structural level, we hear that, I mean, reports say that they have this rivalry within the group itself. Who will become the leader? As there is an Europe wing, there is an Africa wing perhaps, and there's the North America wing that is trying to have control over the shares of financial power, for example, within the group. Who will lead the group next? How this power will be shared among different figures within the group, it's still something that time will show. But in terms of their activities in many European capitals, in North America, they are still even though it is not as strong as before, they're still able to carry out their activities. And despite Turkey asking for cooperation when it comes to dealing with this terrorist group, unfortunately, Turkey did not receive the support that it needed when it comes to fighting this group within Turkey, but also when it comes to showing that this group is not how it appears. They are still able to organize themselves. They're still able to conduct defamation or different propaganda against Turkey. They're still able to carry out very strong financial activities abroad. So in that sense, perhaps for within Turkey, that threat is minimized. But when it comes to their international activities, we cannot say that the international community, or at least many traditional allies of Turkey, have supported Turkey's fight against terrorist groups.
And what are the sort of efforts that are being made by the Turkish government to ensure that terror organizations are combated and this sort of thing might never happen again?
Well, first of all, when we talk about terrorist groups in general, a fight against terror and counter-terrorism operations are not just through hard power. I think there was in a sense, they played with the very strategic codes of this society, right? And as a very conservative society, the fact that they exploited the religious sentiments of the public, that played a lot with the sociological mosaic of Turkey. So in that sense, the counterterrorism or making sure that this terror group does not reorganize itself or others don't emerge, within rule of law, Turkey has taken every step. It is not just hard power that Turkey is using, but in terms of institutional reorganization, in terms of education, in terms of making sure that the public awareness is maximized when it comes to these cult-like entities. Turkey is taking a very comprehensive approach to fight not only FETO, but other groups that could perhaps use FETO-like motivations or methods to have influence over democracy in Turkey, to have influence over democratically elected officials in Turkey. And this is something that I think will require much longer than 9 years as we are going through the 9th year anniversary.
And we are going to be hearing about the Turkish Marif Foundation and its efforts to change those recruitment hubs that were used by FETO terror group into education centres. And of course, this is an important strategic move for Türkiye. What are some of the other areas, as well as education, the likes of culture, that Türkiye is expanding its influence?
Well, I think, you know, in terms of Marif and schools, why and maybe it's important to highlight why this is important, because FETO charter schools, they would pick not only successful students, but students from very influential families. And this is a method where they can have influence over very important figures in any country that they operate. In addition to Marif, I think media is one of the biggest areas where FETO is using in fight against Türkiye. In that sense, the media awareness or the biases about Türkiye shouldn't be influenced or shouldn't be under the umbrella of FETO members. In that sense, I think there is a big job. Of course, look, it's very understandable that there is a bias against Türkiye in the Western media. But it is one thing to objectively criticize. It's another thing to have this very ideological bias against Türkiye. And I think FETO, as a movement or as a cult-like terror network or as this secretive entity, they have very strong influence over Western media. And in that sense, I think Türkiye needs to still able to show the real face of FETO, not only to citizens within Türkiye, which successfully they have done that, but also internationally, there's a lot that needs to be done. And TRT World is doing a great job, I think, in that sense, and many other international outlets within Türkiye. For media is one of them. The other is, I think, diplomacy and different lobby groups in Western capitals that are trying to affect foreign policy against Türkiye and try to influence decision makers against Türkiye. So far, I think Türkiye's diplomatic muscle has also grown very effectively. Türkiye is playing a huge role in different conflicts as a mediator in its region and beyond. So in that sense, there's a lot that will change, but it is taking time.
Mehmet Celik, editorial coordinator at Daily Sabah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Isabel.
The Turkish Marif Foundation has been helping transform the former schools used by the FETO terror organisation as recruitment hubs into international education centres. Since its establishment in 2016, the foundation has taken charge of a considerable number of those education centres and turned them into reputable institutions aligned with international standards. Türkiye says this is one of the most successful operations against the terrorist organisation after the defeated coup attempt on July 15, 2016. Belkis Demirjan has more.
Working with Turkey's Ministry of National Education, Marif is the only Turkish body authorized to provide education abroad, part of an effort to prevent the resurgence of any terror-linked schools. Operating in over 50 countries, the foundation has grown into one of the top 5 international education networks globally. With students from all over the world, it plays a central role in Turkey's soft power diplomacy.
All around the world, we have 70,000 students, and these students are very important to strengthen Turkey's relations. As you know, Turkey has excellent relations with Africa, with Asia, with Latin America, with Balkans, with Europe. But the educational dimension of these relations are now more strong with Turkish Marif Foundation.
This year, the foundation marked a milestone, hosting its 9th graduation ceremony in Istanbul, where its students celebrated their achievements within its expanding global network.
These students mostly prefer continue their higher education in Turkey, and they became a bridge between their cultures, their population, and Turkey.
The students are not only educated, but also supported with housing, cultural and sporting activities, helping them adapt to new environments and thrive.
Marif is a good foundation and they help me a lot. And whenever you want to feel comfortable abroad, I just suggest you to join Marif.
The foundation positions itself as a multi-layered education system that invests in future generations.
Marif gives us a lot of things, like we don't pay for the university like they they give us a scholarship, a middle scholarship.
The Turkish Marif Foundation gives Turkey a vast number of honorary ambassadors to deepen relations worldwide, while preventing hypocritical activities of any organization to use education as a tool to destabilize Turkey. It transforms schools, builds bridges between cultures, and promotes Turkish conscience of humanity. Belkıs Demircan, TRT World, Istanbul.
And to discuss this further, joining me now here in the studios is Mustafa Caner. He's an assistant professor of Middle East Institute at Sakarya University. Mustafa, great to have you here with us on TRT World. I can't believe 9 years have passed. You know, when all of this was unfolding, of course, I was not in the country at the time. I was watching it on television. And at the time, there's this one phrase from the Turkish president that really stands out for me. You know, at the time when he was speaking to the public via an iPhone, I believe, on, I think it was a media outlet where he was speaking. And he used this phrase, I have not seen any power bigger than the power of the people. And I think it was the people that defeated this coup. And of course, these are some archive footages of that. This was the interview that I was talking about. Through his iPhone, he was able to communicate to the public and send a very strong message. What do you make of that 9 years on?
I think Mr. President's words are clearly reflecting the very definition of democracy, because democracy means that it's the will of people, the power of people. So people can actually decide their own future, their own, course of life, their own policies. So coup attempt means stealing the will of people, stealing the power of democracy from people, actually. So by fighting against these terrorists, these coup plotters, actually people rescued their democratic rights, their democracy, their country from these coup plotters, from these terrorists. So actually Turkish people that night showed the whole world that how democracy is preserved, how can it be preserved by the people themselves, people of the country. So people claim their own destiny, their own right to determine their own future. So I think that means a lot. That tells us a lot about the very meaning of democracy, the value of democracy, and how Turkish people actually saved their country from these terrorists who were attacking their democratic rights. Because people actually voted for a government, for a president, and this was an elected government. And any attempt to overthrow the elected government means an attacking against democracy. So people actually show that how democracy can be, protected from these terrorists. I think that means a lot.
Of course, it's been 9 years now. Let's talk about the future. Of course, Turkey is a country before July 15, 2016. It saw many coups happen over its history. But what do you think this day, July 15, 2016, means for the future of Turkish democracy? Because, many would say that the era of coups happening in this country was basically put to an end by the Turkish people with their will on that day 9 years ago?
It's a great question, actually, and we should look at how the state itself has gone under a radical transformation after July 15 coup attempt, how state institutions cleared themselves from these terrorist infiltrators, these FETO members, and how state regained its independence, and how Turkish army, for example, restructured and could conduct these cross-border operations inside Syria, inside northern part of Syria, and how Turkish military showed its muscle, and how it turned the table, actually, how it turned the game in Middle East, and how it defended Turkish national interests. And after that, Turkey actually changed and reoriented its foreign policy posture completely, actually, when it comes to Middle East. And the whole narrative, the whole picture about Syria and the Middle East had changed after the July 15 coup attempt, because by getting rid of these terrorist cells inside the army, Turkish armed forces could be able to conduct these cross-border operations, and by showing its muscle, Turkey actually could gain a spot, could gain a chair at the diplomacy table and acquire a very important place. And with Russia and Iran, launched a peace process in Syria. It was called Astana Peace Process, and it was very functional in terms of creating a safe zone, northern part of the Syria, and reaching a ceasefire. You know, since the 2017, Syria has been enjoying a ceasefire until, you know, December 8, because after December 8, we are talking about a totally new Syria. But during that era, actually, Turkey could find a way to realize its foreign policy objectives in Syria. It was very actually functional, and by conducting these operations, Turkey got rid of PKK and Daesh terrorists in the northern part of the Syria, and opened a clear corridor, cleared from terrorist elements. And also it was very functional for sending some of the refugees from Syria back to that positions and giving their normal life to them. Not all of them, but some numbers of the refugees could come back to their countries. And also oppositional forces, oppositional groups in the northern part of the Syria acquired some power to conduct their final operation against Assad government. So it was an actually long journey, but I think we can say that it began just after the failed coup attempt, and Turkey had changed the whole picture when it comes to, you know, Middle East.
Right, you know, Professor, as you were talking, I was looking at the archive pictures from 9 years ago, and unbelievable pictures. I mean, these terrorists were basically after the Turkish people, because you see the Turkish people on the streets, and basically these are the people who are being bombed by those fighter jets in the sky. I believe these are pictures from the Turkish capital, if I'm not mistaken. These scenes were recorded outside the presidential complex in the Turkish capital. And of course, the presidential complex was only one of the places bombed. It was the Turkish Parliament. Then, of course, you have many places here in Istanbul which were bombed. You know, when you look at these pictures and when you see the resilience of Turkish people, because despite the bombs, these people stood on the streets. Because, you know, as I've said before, it was their will that defeated this coup attempt. What kind of message do you think the Turkish people sent to the international community on that day?
This is a very epic story of Turkish people. They sacrificed their lives, actually, for the sake of country, for the sake of their democracy. And when we look at these videos, these images, we are seeing that how courageous Turkish people are, and how they easily sacrifice their everything for the sake of their country. So how patriotic Turkish people are. So how are they claiming their democratic rights? Because as I mentioned before, this was not only an attack against a democratically elected government. This was an attack against the country, against the people of the country, against the independence of the country. So Turkish people said that not that easy. So we are on your way. We are gonna fight until the end. So we are gonna sacrifice everything, but we'll rescue, but we'll save our country. So this is a very strong, very clear message to the international community, because some external powers explicitly, and some of them implicitly, supported this coup attempt. So Turkish people clearly said that never again. As you know, we have a history of military coups in Turkey. Yep. So Turkish people said that never again. We are not gonna let that happen again. We are not gonna let the will of ours, the will of people be stolen away from us again. So these images, these videos are really, powerful.
Indeed. I mean, I'm actually at a loss of words right now, because if you see on the other side, it's the FETO terrorist organization. Their members trying to infiltrate, trying to stage a coup in the country. And on the other hand, you see the Turkish people with nothing in their hands, no weapons, just their bare hands. And with that will, with that power, with that resilience, they were able to defeat this coup attempt. Mustafa Caner, fascinating insights. Thanks very much for joining me here in the studios.
Thank you.
And now we have correspondents across Turkey. Andrew Hopkins is at the presidential complex in the Turkish capital, Ankara. Kubra Akkoç is standing by for us at the 15th of July Martyrs Bridge here in Istanbul.
And we have Hassan Abdullah at the Turkish Parliament and Rumeysa Çota in Istanbul. She today was on one of the ships that was sailing in the Istanbul Strait in memory of those who lost their lives defending democracy.
All right, let's begin in the Turkish capital. Let's bring in TRT World's diplomatic correspondent, Andrew Hopkins. So, Andrew, of course, the presidential complex where you are right now was also one of the places bombed on that night. So, of course, it's been 9 years now, but I believe the memories, the horrors of that night are still very fresh among the people who live in the Turkish capital now. So tell me, what are people telling you today? How are they reflecting on that night?
Well, absolutely. The people who were around 9 years ago who took to the streets, very terrifying experience for them, very distressing experience as well. But throughout the events today in the Turkish capital, the political leaders of the country have been paying their respects, if you like, to the people who gave their lives, who showed their braveness in the face of the attack by FETO on July the 15th, 2016. We've had events here at the presidential complex earlier on today. It started with a wreath laying by the Turkish Vice President Cevdet Yilmaz at the July the 15th Martyrs Monument inside the presidential complex grounds. And as you mentioned, on that night, 9 years ago, there was strafing of the streets by the military aircraft in the surrounding areas around the presidential complex. After that, the Turkish president was at the Parliament building also. The same night, there were airstrikes on that building as well, and you can still go inside the Parliament now and see where the resulting sort of warped metal is from that attack. It's now been turned effectively into a museum and memorial. After that, the Turkish president went to the police special forces headquarters here just outside the Turkish capital. That also came under attack from aircraft operated by FETO. there, something like 50 people were killed, members of the police forces, in what you would expect to be a very secure location. And then at the moment, the Turkish president back here in the presidential complex for an evening, what's been called a sort of an epic, which is a sort of a ceremony involving aspects of theatre and music, telling one particular aspect of the story about the head of the counter-terrorism department who was targeted by FETO several years ago, and describing how he experienced all that several years ago. So quite a full day of events here in Ankara, effectively paying tribute to all the people showing their bravery and coming out on the streets 9 years ago.
Kubra joins us live from the July 15 monument, which honours the victims here in Istanbul. Kubra, tell us a little bit about the commemorations that have been taking place today.
Well, Isabel, we are in front of this monument overlooking the July 15 Martyrs Bridge. Of course, it was previously known as the Bosphorus Bridge. It was later named as July 15 Martyrs Bridge because 34 people were killed by FETO terror group members on that night on this bridge. For many people, this bridge signifies where it all started because FETO terror group members, they came here, they blocked the entrance of this very bridge and started to open fire on unarmed civilians. That's why many commemorations have been taking place around this place, on this bridge, in front of this monument, where the names of those who lost their lives, who were brutally killed by FETO terror group members are being showcased, where the recitation of Quran and also Salah prayers were conducted to honor their memories, relatives of those people, and also Turkish people coming from different cities across Turkey were here. They paid tribute, they paid their respects, and they came here to reflect and remember the night that changed the course of the modern Turkish history, because everyone remembers it started at 10 p.m. on that bridge here in Istanbul, and we also saw the next morning, 6 a.m., people on top of the tanks where coup plotters were surrendering, victorious people were posing for the pictures so that Turkish people can take a deep breath that it was finally over. It was in the course of 8 hours. This bridge signifies lots of things for Turkish people, and people who came here had a lot of mixed feelings. Of course, on the one side, it is the celebration of the victory of democracy. It's the celebration of the night of defiance, night of resilience, night of unity, but also some wounds are still very fresh, and it was very visible on the faces of those people who came here to honor the memories and pay their respects to those who lost their lives.
And now we can bring in TRT World's Hassan Abdullah. He joins me live from the Turkish Parliament in the capital, Ankara. Now, Hassan, good to see you. Of course, the Parliament is also one of the most iconic sites when we talk about July 15th, 2016. Just walk us through what happened on that night in this Parliament, and how are people reacting, reflecting rather, on the events of July 15, 2016?
Well, Jafar, basically what happened, just about a kilometre from here is the Ankara city centre, and we saw tanks that were rolling towards the parliament on that day. There were also those coup soldiers who tried to break into the parliament, and there was quite a bit of fighting that was witnessed around here. Now, while they were trying to push into the parliament, shortly afterwards, F-16s appeared above the parliament, and they carried out at least 3 strikes on the Turkish parliament, damaging the main lobby area, as well as one of the bombs dropped just outside the main parliament building. Now, what happened was that from one of the entrances, some parliamentarians rushed towards the parliament. There were those who were already present in there, including the Speaker of the Parliament at that time, who made an announcement that they're going to stand firm and that they're going to protect their democracy. But I think what was really spectacular was that the general public that had been trying to resist the tanks, they moved from the Kızılay direction, that's the Ankara city centre. They came towards the parliament, and they were trying to use their vehicles to block the tanks from entering the parliament compound. and they were basically trying to do whatever they could to prevent those coup soldiers from being successful. Also then what ensued was a fight between some of the police forces as well as the special forces that came in, reinforcements came in to try to prevent the coup soldiers from taking over the parliament, and we saw public that joined them as well. Of course, the public didn't have any weapons, but they had that courage, that resilience, and about 2 hours or so after this, they announced that they had managed to push back those coup soldiers. So of course, what happened here 9 years ago, as it has been described by the Turkish president and other politicians here, this has been unprecedented in Turkish history. It was the first time a physical attack of this sort was carried out on the Turkish parliament, and they say that this was meant to be very symbolic. It was meant to be an attack on the democracy itself, and hence the sort of reaction, the defense from the public in support of their democracy.
Hassan Abdullah, our diplomatic correspondent live there from Ankara. Thank you. Going back to Istanbul now, and our correspondent Rumeysa Choda, who was on board a ship sailing the Bosphorus today in memory of the July 15 martyrs. So, Rumeysa, we're hearing from Kubra just how significant the Bosphorus Bridge, renamed for those martyrs from 9 years ago who were killed. Tell us a little bit about this sailing today that commemorated those who were martyred in the failed coup 9 years ago.
Well, Isabel, Istanbul has set the scene for the visual feast as part of July 15 commemorations event. Over 250 boats sail through the Istanbul Strait. Each of the boats represents a martyr, over 250 martyrs who have been killed by the coup plotters on the night of July 15, 2016, while they're resistant against the coup attempt. And the atmosphere in the port was quite tense but deeply passionate as these maritime cortege joined by the hundreds of people, including the families of the martyrs. And of course, they've been watching that parade with tears and honor as well. They've been saying that they're not considering the night of July 15 as a day of tragedy, but also a day of honor. Of course, there's no chance to bring their loved ones back. Of course, no chance to replace the memories. But of course, they're saying that like they're sad, and also like proud of their loved ones that now the democracy has been protected with their strong will and determination on the night of defiance. Because on that night, the members of the FETO terror group tried to overthrow the democratically elected government, and those people tried to stop the tanks and the gunfires with their bare hands. But unfortunately, the chaos and the attacks by the coup plotters claimed the lives of over 250 people and left over 2,000 injured. And now today, it's actually with their help and their strong will, and they have defeated the coup attempt. But now, July 15 is a national holiday. A massive commemorations event took place throughout today in Istanbul, across Turkey, and Stalin Parade was just one of them. And we are also seeing that Turkish flag hang on the major bridges in Istanbul, and also an exhibition named the name of the victory is Türkiye, also displayed in the Istanbul airport. But across Europe, in numerous cities like Vienna, Warsaw, Tirana, and Sarajevo, there were panel discussions with the major focus on the threats of the FETO terrorist organization and its linked institutions situated in those cities, and also depicts the story of the country.
We are back on the banks of the iconic Bosphorus Strait. With me, I have former U.S. Ambassador Matthew Bryson. We're going to pick up where we left off. We were talking about July 15th, its impact on Turkish foreign policy. We had looked deeply into the relationship with the U.S. I want to talk about another country, Russia. Now, you were posted in Moscow, so you know Russia well. You know Türkiye well. Obviously, you were a State Department official. You know the United States well. Now, I had a guest earlier who was laying down this domino effect theory, linking FETO to some U.S. and Turkish foreign policy movements and how the Russia relationship developed. And one of the things he had said, and I found very interesting, you had the downing of a Russian jet in 2015. You had the assassination of a Russian ambassador in Türkiye. Both of these events were linked to FETO. And then you had the coup attempt. You had the weak U.S. response. You had a very quick phone call from Russian President Vladimir Putin. And then when we look at the trajectory of Turkish foreign policy, at least its relationship with Russia, we have an uptick going there that goes on to more cooperation to where we are today. How impactful was July 15th, the U.S. response and the Russian response in your eyes on how Turkey moved forward from a foreign policy perspective?
Oh, I think it had a gigantic impact. Yeah, you think back to, it was I think November 2015 when Turkey shot down that Sukhoi 24, Su-24. Relations were terrible. There were sanctions by Russia on Turkey. Remember, they cut off tourism, cut off tomato exports.
The tomato wars.
The tomato wars, yeah, that was a serious thing for exporters. And it all ended when President Erdogan wrote a letter, and I won't say a letter of apology, but an apologetic tone to President Putin. And Putin was just waiting, as he always does, for the opportunity to take advantage. I mean, as we all know, for centuries, the Russian dream has been to get control of the Turkish Straits. Putin is no exception. And in Turkish history, however, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, has fought more wars against Russia, the Russian Empire, than any other country. So there's always been a push and pull in Turkey's approach to Russia, whereby Turkey understands the danger, but doesn't want unnecessary acrimony with Russia, want to manage the relationship. So Putin knows that. He was waiting for an opportunity. As you said, I think when he saw the very weak initial U.S. response and called President Erdogan quickly, and even, there's all sorts of speculation that maybe Putin also said, the U.S., Fethullah Gülen, they're really the ones behind the coup. We tried to warn you about it. I think that had an impact here. It had an impact on President Erdogan. On top of that, we're getting to the S-400s. We all recall that the FETO-controlled Air Force planes seemed to be certainly harassing and maybe planning to try to shoot down President Erdogan's presidential aircraft.
It was a big concern that night. I mean, I remember Erdogan's plane landing at Atatürk Airport, and the big question was, were they going to shoot down his plane? Is he going to be able to make it? Obviously, Turkey didn't have capable air defense at that time, and then the S-400s offered. The U.S. is not selling Patriots. It is strings attached. There was a lot of confusion during that period.
There was, and so think of it from the perspective of a human being. Happens to be the president. His plane was maybe going to be attacked by what? By F-16s. What air defense system is designed to shoot down F-16s? The S-400s. So I think probably from President Erdogan's perspective, there was an operational reason to take a look at the S-400s. There was a sense of the U.S. maybe somehow having been involved with the coup attempt, and that soft response, as you said earlier, that gave President Putin a huge opening, and he exploited it. But at the end of the day, Turkey is a NATO member state. It's not in Putin's back pocket. There's a lot of criticism in Washington that it had been or is. That's false. Turkey is a NATO member state, as I said, fought more wars against Russia than any other country. It wants to be, and has always been, a model member of the NATO alliance, but it doesn't want unnecessary acrimony with Russia. So President Erdogan then avoided joining the sanctions after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, kept the communications channel open, but also has consistently and unambiguously condemned Russia's invasion and called for the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, and enabled and supported strong military technological cooperation between Turkey and Ukraine.
Another important topic, or at least fact, was that the Russians pushed the FETO group out of their country before anyone else. That was very, very interesting as well. And I think that kind of won a little favor or trust with Erdogan. As you were saying, there was a lot of mistrust between the U.S. and Turkey at that moment. They're like, were the Americans behind it? What type of relationship? I mean, these types of things during moments of stress could get blown out of proportion. But again, we go back to the weak response. I kind of feel if Obama went in strong, that maybe Erdogan probably would not have taken a second look at the Russia relationship. But let's move on to Trump again, at least the first term. So you have Trump in office. They seem to have some type of chemistry between Trump and Erdogan. You have the Brunson crisis. You have CAATSA sanctions, despite Trump not wanting to impose them. He gets his hand forced. Can you talk about that period? How was the relationship there, and how did Trump manage that period?
Yeah, so Trump, as we said before, he really admires and likes President Erdogan. It was the Congress that did force Trump's hand to apply CAATSA sanctions. When they had their initial meeting, Trump and Erdogan, it went over very well. But you know, for Trump, I mean, he doesn't have a strategic concept for anything, right? And certainly not for foreign policy, and not for relations with Turkey. So he at least within the system and in the State Department throughout this period, there was a desire to deal with Syria in a different way than the Obama administration had, meaning the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces that the Pentagon admitted subsequently they just changed the name, right, to the Syrian Democratic Forces to kind of fool everybody and not to see that these were members of a PKK affiliate. Well, in 2019, President Trump, or maybe earlier, President Trump had decided that the U.S. forces would leave northern Syria, remember, right? And the U.S. would sort of turn over the security function in northern Syria to Turkey. That generated all sorts of howls in Washington, but that was Trump saying, look, we don't want to be tied down in Syria. We've got NATO's second largest military, NATO member state bordering Syria. They want to be there to maintain security. I like the leader of the country. Why don't we get out and let the Turkish forces come in? Trump, I think, wanted to pull U.S. forces entirely out of Syria, but Pentagon commanders, especially CENTCOM, wanted the U.S. troops to stay. And so they said, well, we need the U.S. troops on the ground in Deir ez-Zor to protect the oil fields. But Trump, I think, wanted to get out early. And he had contrary advice. You remember then Secretary of Defense Mattis resigned as a result of the U.S. pullout. But Trump wanted to rely on Turkey and its responsibility being for the security of northern Syria.
I want to get back to the FETO organization's presence in the U.S. Now, obviously, with their so-called leader, now deceased, him not being a big problem, but you still have elements of the group over there. Obviously, Turkey is interested in extraditing these people back. There's been a lot of back and forth judicially. Do you think that this will be a priority next time Trump and Erdogan get together? Or has this been downgraded on both sides where they're now looking very realpolitik at bilateral trade, solving Russia-Ukraine, Israel-Iran, what's going on in Gaza? Has that way overtaken the FETO or the YPG issue?
Well, that depends on President Erdogan on the Turkish side. How much do they want to remain focused on the YPG and the FETO issue? I think when it comes to YPG, I mean, you know, the YPG has officially agreed to integrate into the Syrian National Army, and the PKK here has pledged to lay down arms. We just saw the ceremony last Friday with the weapons being burned. But in reality, the YPG is still operating autonomously in Syria. It's not living up to the letter of the agreement with the al-Shara government. So we may see that become an issue again. Clearly, the United States supports the territorial integrity of Syria. Ambassador Barak, who's now, as we were saying before, the U.S. envoy for Syria, as well as the ambassador to Turkey, he wants to see that agreement by the YPG concluded, which is a complete twist in the way the U.S. used to support and rely on the YPG. Now we've got the Trump administration saying, for the good of a stable and unified Syria, the YPG needs to live up to the letter of its agreement. So the YPG could become an issue of cooperation with the Trump administration. When it comes to FETO, though, I think it's probably not on Trump's radar, and he would need to be reminded of it. by President Erdogan, and I think what you said is probably the way things are going to go, that I think President Erdogan is going to move on in a realpolitik way, with the FETO issue still being kind of an irritant for him, that the U.S. hasn't taken more steps to disband and extradite the members of FETO. But I think President Erdogan sees a real opportunity to move on with someone he likes and to then resurrect some semblance, as we were saying before, of a strategic partnership between the two countries.
It doesn't look like Erdogan's going to push the issue with Trump too much for the mistakes, let's say, let's not call it the sins, but the mistakes of previous presidents. We're going to continue hopefully later on. Thanks for your analysis. We're going to go back to the studio for more coverage on July 15th.
Despite Turkey's implementation of stringent measures to combat the FETO terrorist organisation, it's managed to expand its presence and sustain its activities in various countries. The US is known to be a safe haven for FETO activities, with extensive networks of schools and businesses. It operates across several fields and engages in political lobbying. Its ringleader found shelter there from 1999 until his death. US authorities refused to extradite Gulen despite the existence of an extradition treaty between the two countries. Many European countries have refused to acknowledge the FETO terror group as the perpetrator of the coup and have not taken significant actions against it. FETO terrorist organisation members residing in EU countries have fled persecution in Türkiye and found haven in some countries. Taking advantage of Turkey's historically and culturally strong ties with the Balkan countries, the terror group has made inroads in this region, primarily in education and media. It still operates numerous schools. The FETO terrorist organisation has established a presence in almost every African country, taking advantage of Turkey's close relations with the continent. After the coup attempt in 2016, some countries responded to Ankara's requests, limiting their activities. Following the fall of the Soviet Union, the FETO terror group benefited from liberalisation in the region and established strategic organisations, particularly in the economic sector. Russia and Uzbekistan have been the first countries to address the threat posed by the terror organisation.
Now, after Turkey's failed coup in 2016, Somalia was one of the first countries to shut down the schools linked to the FETO terrorist organisation. Those schools were handed over to Turkey's Marif Foundation. Today, they have taken a different direction. Abdirahman Yusuf reports.
In the middle of Mogadishu, not far from the busy Kilometer 4 junction, there's a school that's changed a great deal over the years. It used to be tied to a foreign terror network. Now, it's run by Turkey's Marif Foundation. And what's happening inside these classrooms? It's turning heads.
We follow the International Marif program. We also got accreditation from Oxford University. We're the first in Somalia to offer IGCSE. We train students not only to prosper here in Somalia, but also globally.
That recognition helped open doors for students inside and outside Somalia.
Marif gave me the base I needed. Without that, I wouldn't have studied abroad. Now I'm back home, working and trying to give something back to the society.
Not everyone came from here. Abdullah was born and raised in Norway, then moved to Mogadishu.
When I came to Somalia, I started as in questioning myself what to do. I heard about Turkish Marif. I came here and blended in very easily. The school education, the quality, the teachers, the facilities, the laboratory, everything was perfect. He helped me out very much in anything I needed. I didn't know Arabic, for example. I didn't know a lot about English. I learned Arabic, English. I learned more Somali. I even learned Turkish, extra.
Education doesn't always get much attention in Somalia. But for families who've seen nothing but loss, this kind of access means everything. And it's not just for the top students. Marif now runs 3 schools in Somalia, serving over 1,200 students. For some, it's the only chance they've had.
I'm displaced from Bakul. I couldn't afford school for my child. If not for Marif, my son will still be at home, just like thousands of other Somali kids.
The goal here isn't just grades. It's giving students something solid to build on: language, skills, direction. What started with a takeover is now turning into something else, an education system that's slowly building trust and futures. Abdurrahman Yusuf, TRT World, Mogadishu, Somalia.
Mehmet Çelik is the editorial coordinator at Daily Sabah, and he joins me now here in the studios. Mehmet, good to see you. So, over the past 45 minutes, we have been seeing many different archive pictures of that night. My director is going to play some of those pictures on that wall in a short while. And of course, you see the parliament being bombed, you see the presidential complex being bombed, and you see FETO terrorist organization members bombing the 15th of July Martyrs Bridge, formerly known as the Bosphorus Bridge. A lot has happened. I mean, as a Turk, as someone who works in this country as a journalist, what crossed your mind when you were seeing those pictures live on television on that night?
Well, first of all, we were also working. I was working as a journalist, and I was on duty actually at that night. So first of all, of course, you, as a human instinct, you think about yourself, your loved ones, and people around you. But in the bigger picture, what we think about is the future of this country. And I think many people knew that this terror group will not be successful. But I think the biggest question mark was in many people's mind was how far will they go in their attempt to carry out this coup attempt, to this coup? How far are they going to go in terms of bombing different places? Whether they will actually even bomb some of the residential areas. As you know, the F-16s were flying low at the time. And when we heard these sonic booms, I was, of course, this is not something that I have lived through my lifetime when it comes to this, something like Cold War in this country. But the sonic booms effect, for me personally, I was wondering whether they're actually going to go as far as bombing residential areas. We were seeing pictures from the bridge from different areas in Ankara, from significant places like the parliament or their takeover in the TRT, etc. But how far they will go against Turkish citizens, against Turkish society, was a big question mark in my mind, and that was quite scary, because when you see that they are holding their guns against just the general average on the street, when they are bombing the parliament, then you for a second you think, will they have a limit, even though they will not be successful, but during the course of their attempt, how far will they go? I think this was something that made me think about at that night.
Right, and of course, for our international audience, these are scenes that were recorded on the 15th of July Martyrs Bridge, formerly known as the Bosphorus Bridge. Of course, you can see chaos unfolding there, but what really stands out for me, for example, from this picture, is despite the bombs, despite the constant firing from FETO members, people stood their ground, and I think this is the reason why. The will of the people is the reason why they were able to defeat this coup. But, of course, Mehmet, we saw many events unfold on that night. For example, the FETO members occupied the Bosphorus Bridge, and then you also saw attacks on the parliament, on the presidential complex, and the F-16s, of course, that were flying both in the Turkish capital and here in Istanbul as well. And, I mean, of course, it lasted for hours, but what would you say was the turning point that made the coup plotters think, okay, we're losing now? Was it that interview that the Turkish president did with a media outlet?
For me, I think the people's will to go out on the street when they saw that Turkish people held on to this and stood against this, basically, regardless of their political affiliation. When they saw that despite the bombs, despite the gunfire, people risked their lives, they put their lives in the front line to stand against this invasion. And I call it specifically, I use this term invasion, because previously in my previous shows I said that this wasn't a very traditional coup. This was an attempt to invade the state. This was an this was an attempt to invade the country. Now, and of course, when they saw the people going out on the street in almost every single city, this was a turning point psychologically. But at the same time, Mr. Erdogan's leadership and people's willing to stand behind him, regardless of their political affiliation, as an elected leader, as a democratically elected leader, I think this was also another turning point. And after his call, people went out on the street, people went to different squares to stand against this, this coup attempt, and the different parts of the country saw that slowly they were being defeated. Of course, not the whole military was with the coup pushists. Not all the police stand against us. Different security mechanisms stood against us, but the will of the people. And after Mr. Erdogan's call, when people went out on the street, they saw that this is not going to be successful. And I think this is a key moment in Turkish modern history, a key moment in Turkish political history. And I specifically say Turkish political history because we have had a long history of coup attempts, or coup actually, that took place in 1960 and 80, in the postmodern coup against the elected government in February 28. But at those times, I think the political authorities, political figures, in a way, they were believed that they had to give in. But Mr. Erdogan's willing to risk his life and his call to people to go out on the street changed the course of history, I think, for Turkish modern history, but also for the political history of the country. This was an end. This event put an end to those coups that the society has been, has every 10 years basically we had to face a coup attempt or a coup that actually was materialized. But with the July 15, with the strong political leadership in the country, with the political consciousness being more aware, and I think a political conscious or that hold on to the democratic will made this coup attempt fail.
Right, and it's been 9 years now, Mehmet, and one thing that really stands out for me is the fact that it's still 9 years on. Turkish people give a lot of importance to this day, 15th of July, 2016. There are still many events being commemorated across the country on this day. Of course, these events are not just there to remember what happened, but also to pay tribute to the ones who lost their lives. More than 250 people were killed by FETO terrorist members on that night. And a lot of what we're talking about today has to do with reflection, right? So let me pick your brain here and ask you something very important. If there was a child who was 1 year old on that day, 15th of July, 2016, when he grows up, when he turns 20, 30, how do you think he's going to be remembering this day? Because before July 15, 2016, when students here in Turkey would go to universities or schools, they would learn about the history of coups in this country, right? But for someone who was born either in 2016 or after 2016, how do you think he's going to remember or look at Türkiye and its relationship with coups that happened in the past?
If this memory is not kept alive, it will be very difficult to remember what took place and the importance of that turning point in Turkish modern history. None of us lived through World War I. None of us lived through World War II. Many of us didn't live through the genocide in different parts, in Bosnia, for example. Some of us are witnessing what's happening in Gaza, but many of us didn't witness the Nakba, for example, in Gaza.
Right.
But that memory has to be kept alive so that the history does not repeat itself. I think for Turkish society, this is very important. For the Turkish political psyche, this is very important. For the Turkish generations that will be remembering today or reading today from history books, it is important that day by day, every year, we keep this memory alive. 250 people didn't risk their lives or lost their lives for no reason. We had more than 2,000 people injured. And aside from, of course, the lost lives, many institutions were damaged within the state. Different sociology of the country was actually exploited through the so-called religious sentiments that this group tried to disguise itself as. So in that sense, the damage wasn't just material damage in terms of the bombing of the parliament. The damage wasn't, of course, just the lost lives, but the damage was done at many different levels. And I think the reason why people held on to this, and this memory should be kept alive for a place like Türkiye, is that the fact that this group wasn't an organic group within Türkiye that evolved to what it became, but it also has a lot of external figure or external entities that had interest in this coup being carried out. As long as the external motivations are not limited, as long as the external motivations to carry out a coup in Türkiye is not diminished, that threat against Türkiye will still continue. For that reason, this national consciousness, I think that was erected at July 15 should be kept alive for future generations.
Fascinating insights, Mehmet. And as someone who has lived in this country for the past 8 years now, I have been covering the anniversary of the July 15 coup for the past 8 years, and I have not seen that memory fade in any way.
Jafar, for many, they start hearing about FETO on July 15 or in the events that followed after. But this is a group that has established itself nearly 4 decades ago, or perhaps more. For us to understand, we need to do some homework. We need to really dig deeper into how the group was able to become so strong and becomes an international cult, international network.
Mehmet Çelik, thanks very much. Thanks very much for your analysis.
Thank you.
We are back on the banks of the iconic Bosphorus, and right about now, 9 years ago, we saw the beginnings of the failed coup attempt unfolding. To my left right now, we have Kuleli Military Academy, the Bosphorus Bridge, two very important venues from July 15th, a very important story that shaped the modern history of Turkey, at least the past decade of Turkey, from many perspectives. But I'm here with former U.S. Ambassador Matthew Bryza, and we're taking a much closer look at the foreign policy and the impact July 15th had. Now, this is round 3 between you and I, and one of the statements you made earlier really stuck in my mind when you were talking about it took a while for U.S. diplomats and U.S. officials to really understand what happened here on July 15th, 9 years ago. Do they really understand right now? Do you feel that if you sat down, had a in-depth conversation with them, that they would understand the nuances of what happened here, and that they felt that, well, the Turkish reaction, the Turkish initiatives taken were all justified?
Well, the U.S. government's big, and so it depends on which part we're talking about. As we already said, Secretary of State Kerry reacted, I think, in a totally inappropriate way for a NATO ally. But the people, the diplomats who cover Turkey, who know about it, who served here, they understood. They knew what was going on. But it was certain elements of the U.S. military, the Central Command, that had a vested interest in doing things that Turkey didn't want to have happen in Syria, working with the YPG. I think they don't understand what happened. They don't want to. It's not in their interests. And then you've got a lot of people in the journalistic world and in think tanks who assumed that Turkey was somehow broken. They looked at President Erdogan's reaction to the coup, meaning to go after the perpetrators, and they were manipulated into, or really believed sincerely, that there was an overreaction by President Erdogan, and that the purges went too far with hundreds of thousands of people. What those critics in the United States don't understand is there were hundreds of thousands of people that had penetrated all of these services.
There was no other way that you could launch a coup without having hundreds of thousands of people. It's not like 5 people can get together and undertake such a massive undertaking to bring down, topple a government.
Yeah, that was just, if I could hop in for that, that's a point that was really driving my own reaction and thinking at the time. What was happening? This coordination across cities and branches of the military. You can't do that without an organization. It has to be run by some organization.
You had F-16s up in the air.
Yes, exactly.
Not under the command of the Turkish government, just the process of getting an F-16 up in the air.
Yes.
It takes multiple people, and you had multiple F-16s up in the air. I remember hearing them with those low cruises throughout the night when I was in Ankara on July 15th. Well, I want to go on to NATO real quickly before I move on to Europe. Last year in the communique, for the first time, obviously there's always this condemnation of terror, but I saw the word terror in all its forms. Now, anyone who follows Erdogan knows that's his language, terror in all its forms. And I think that was more geared towards the YPG, but obviously FETO probably on the back of Erdogan's mind as well. How important was it for Erdogan to get that rhetoric inside a NATO communique?
Yeah, for the reasons you're saying, I think very important, because he is felt unheard. when there's talk of FETO, but also YPG, right? And you had, think back to in around 2015 or so, when then, God rest his soul, then Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter was testifying before the Senate. Then at that point, Senator Lindsey Graham said, essentially, isn't the YPG a branch of the PKK, and isn't the PKK a terrorist organization? Secretary Carter said, yes, yes. And then Graham said, and now can you understand why the Turkish government is so upset with the United States partnership with YPG? And Carter said, yes. So, yeah, for President Erdogan, that was vindication.
It doesn't take a genius. I'm being told we're running out of time very, very quickly. The Turkey-EU relationship, sure. I really want to touch on this. How has July 15th impacted that?
The backlash that I talked about before that happened in the United States with criticism of the Turkish government's purging of the terrorist organization from the government ranks here hurt Turkey's accession, because in Europe even fewer people even care to understand the reality here. And I think back to Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, a statement he made, which is Turkey will never be part of the EU because the EU is a Christian organization. So because, well, Turkey is not, you have people ready to look for reasons why accession to the EU shouldn't proceed. And we've also got, of course, the Cyprus dispute as well.
Former U.S. Ambassador Matthew Bryzet, thanks for joining me. You've been watching special coverage of the July 15th commemoration here on the banks of the Bosphorus. Thanks for watching us tonight.
Thanks very much, Yusuf, and that wraps up the special coverage of the 9th anniversary of the 2016 failed coup attempt here in Türkiye. There's still commemorations of that day are underway across the country.
The Turkish nation demonstrated its unity once again today, showing resolve for their national unity and solidarity and commitment to democracy. So that wraps up our special coverage. But the news continues here on TRT World. Bye from us, me, Isabel Ewing.
And me, Jafar Hasnan. Bye-bye.